This is Flare and Flow by The Legend of Chel on AO3. Chapter 5, Scorch. Keith regained awareness bit by bit. The first thing he noticed was that it was dark, even after opening his eyes. Shifting around, he realized he was curled up in some kind of chest or trunk. His cloak had been removed, and ropes bound his wrists together behind his back and wrapped around his legs at the ankles and over the knees. A piece of cloth had been stuffed into his mouth, with another longer strip covering his lips and knotting behind his head to keep him from spitting it out. The ground was trembling. Most likely the chest he'd been locked in was being transported in a vehicle of some kind, which meant who knew how far he was from Ponley Valley by now. After allowing himself a moment to panic, Keith tried to assess the situation and formulate a plan. He couldn't firebend in such an enclosed space for fear of accidentally burning himself. Earth and water were also out, since he couldn't conjure those things from nothing, and the container he was in appeared to be made entirely of wood. Keith highly doubted his captors knew he was the Avatar, yet they'd somehow picked the perfect prison for him. There was air, of course, but Keith didn't know the first thing about bending that element, and even if he could figure it out, there was barely enough room to wiggle his fingers, let alone airbend. His knife was missing too. Keith didn't know which was worse, the idea of his mother's blade in the hands of his captors or lying forgotten in some random alley. The rumbling came to a stop, and Keith could hear voices coming closer. "Telling you, for the last time, it's him. Are you sure? He doesn't look that much like the poster. He cut his hair and changed his wardrobe, but yes, I'm sure of it. Take a closer look if you must." The fumbling of a lock. "You better be right. I almost got my face burned off grabbing this kid." Keith squinted against the harsh light that suddenly flooded into his eyes as the trunk opened. Without warning, a rough hand grabbed a fistful of Keith's hair, yanking him upright despite Keith's muffled protest. The blond man's eyes roamed over Keith's face as he held up a copy of the wanted poster. "Huh," he said, glancing between the two. "I do kind of see it now. Great. So can we keep going? It'll take weeks to get to the Fire Nation, and the sooner we turn him over, the sooner we get paid." All right. The man unceremoniously shoved Keith back into the trunk. Keith's eyes widened, and he let out an indignant, but the man ignored him and slammed the lid shut, redoing the lock. With a scowl, Keith shifted around as best as he could in a futile attempt to get comfortable. He tried to think of a way to escape, but all he could really focus on was the swirl of tumultuous emotions raging in the pit of his stomach. Concern about Shiro, resignation that he'd probably never see his new friends again, gratitude that at least they hadn't been caught in the crossfire. But mostly, Keith felt anger. Anger at the bounty hunters for kidnapping him, anger at himself for getting caught, and anger at Lotor for putting Keith in this mess to begin with. At the familiar prickle of frustrated tears, Keith squeezed his eyes shut and curled himself even smaller. He missed Lance. Keith stared dubiously at his reflection, tugging at the stiff collar of the Royal Firebending Academy uniform. At 14, he was finally old enough to enroll in the prestigious school, and, between Shiro's recommendations and Keith's own performance at the entrance exams, getting into the small percentage of accepted applicants had been easy. The uniform itself was tasteful. Keith had always looked good in traditional Fire Nation reds and blacks, and the more militaristic cut suited him. It wasn't super comfortable, though. Keith hoped the stiffness would lessen as he wore it more often, and was glad they had separate uniforms for physical training made of more practical material. A soft knock brought his attention to Shiro, who was leaning against his doorframe. "Hey, ready to go?" Shiro's eyes swept him over. "The uniform looks good on you." "Sure takes me back." Shiro sighed with a fond smile, as if he was an old man reminiscing on his youth, rather than a 20-something who had been wearing the same uniform a few years ago. Keith might have pulled something. He rolled his eyes so hard. "Yeah, I'm ready. And you don't have to come with me, you know." "Oh, come on," Keith squawked as Shiro ruffled his hair. "It's your first day, not just at the academy, but school period. I've got to at least make sure you make it through the front gate." It was true. Between the orphanage and living on the streets, Keith had never attended an actual school before, and he was a little nervous. Shiro's comment about not making it to the gates had been in jest, but Keith was kind of glad Shiro was here to keep him from bailing. Not that Keith would admit that. Keith scoffed at his brother as he tried to finger-comb his hair back into submission. "Please, you're just hoping Adam will be on gate grading duty today." Keith took immense satisfaction in watching Shiro's entire face turn as red as his uniform. Adam was a former classmate of his from the academy. Though his skills were commendable, many students had shunned Adam for his physical features, which took after his Earth Kingdom father rather than his Fire Nation mother. Shiro had no such qualms and immediately sought to befriend him. They had been close ever since. However, where Shiro used his education to jumpstart his military career, Adam had decided to stay at the academy as an instructor. Keith liked Adam and was looking forward to learning more firebending from him. and teasing Shiro mercilessly about getting to see Adam every day when Shiro couldn't. "Shut up, we're going to be late," Shiro muttered, moving towards the front of the house. Snickering, Keith followed. Together, they made their way towards the large campus. Keith was glad they lived within walking distance, since that meant he didn't have to stay in the dorms. He wasn't sure how well he'd handle being in a group living situation like that after the orphanage. Plus, he loved staying with Shiro, and it would be a shame if, after finally regaining a family, Keith could only see him on holidays or the occasional weekend. Soon they made it to the front gates, and Keith's nerves returned at full force. Even Shiro comically drooping when they saw Iverson greeting the students didn't help. "Well, I guess this is it," Shiro said as they stopped just outside the large wall that surrounded the campus. He quickly shook off his disappointment at Adam's absence to give Keith an encouraging smile. "Yeah." Keith eyed the school with trepidation. Shiro gave his shoulder a firm squeeze. "You'll do great, Keith. I know it." Keith looked up at Shiro and tried to absorb all the love and pride he saw in his older brother's eyes to fortify himself. Taking a deep breath, he squared his shoulders, gave Shiro a sharp nod, and walked through the gate. School, it turned out, was incredibly boring. Maybe it came across to the others as arrogant, but Keith didn't find any of the classes challenging. Even the subjects he had little previous knowledge in, such as history or politics, he picked up pretty quick and soon lost interest. He wasn't having much luck in making friends either. Almost immediately after the term started, Keith got into a fight with a classmate named James when the boy implied Keith only got in because of his connection to Shiro. Normally, Keith would have just brushed off such a comment, but James had also insulted Shiro's honor. Not only did Keith get in trouble, but now the other students seemed reluctant to so much as make eye contact with him, for fear of his temper. They all respected his abilities, and some even seemed to admire him from afar, but nobody ever tried to strike up a casual conversation with him. Shiro pointed out that Keith could be the one to instigate a friendship, but Keith didn't have the slightest clue how. And even after getting advice from his brother and Adam, whenever Keith tried to approach someone, they just ran away. Shiro said it was because it was Keith's face that drove them off, which didn't seem fair. It wasn't his fault that his nervous face was identical to his more murdery expressions. Things improved slightly come his second year. In a rare stroke of luck, Keith was put in Adam's class instead of Iverson. Unlike Iverson, who would snap at Keith for improvising a firebending drill to be more to his liking, Adam encouraged his creativity. Not to mention, Keith would sometimes fall into a zen-like state when bending, the rest of the world falling away as he moved through his stances, and when Iverson would jerk him out of it with a barking command, Adam usually let it run its course, gently breaking him out of it if needed. It didn't happen often, but he appreciated the change nonetheless. That was also the year he met Prince Lotor. He had known of the prince's existence, of course. Lotor was 2 years above Keith, so they had never interacted before, but it was hard not to notice when the heir to the nation's throne sat in the same mess hall as you almost every day. One night, Keith was practicing his stances in one of the school's private training dojos. It was after hours, so he was free to try something of his original choreography without fear of anyone getting upset that he was wasting time on moves that weren't part of the curriculum. Keith's bare feet flew across the smooth wooden floor as fire danced around him. In one swift motion, he unsheathed his mother's knife from the small of his back and directed the flames to it. The blade seemed to absorb the fire, small flicks of red and orange covering the metal, though the handle stayed cool to the touch. Keith fluidly shifted into a new form of motion, somewhere between firebending and blade combat. With feline grace, he spun, kicked, and rolled, all the while keeping his dagger ablaze. He hadn't quite perfected the routine yet, but it was coming along nicely. Finally, Keith straightened out of his last pose, slightly out of breath, only to be startled by the soft clap of applause. Spinning, much less gracefully than he had been seconds earlier, Keith saw Prince Lotor standing in the entrance. "That was very beautiful," complimented the prince. Thank you?" Keith registered who he was talking to. Keith registered who he was talking to and hastily bowed, but Lotor waved him off. "Please, there's no need for such formality. We're both students here, after all." Lotor offered a magnanimous smile. Keith wasn't sure how to respond, so he remained silent. "I've never seen that style of fighting before." Lotor sent Keith a curious look. "Oh, well, I sort of made it myself. It still needs work, though," Keith admitted. Lotor nodded, making his way further into the room. "Yes, some parts did look a bit rough, but it was still quite impressive. I'm sure once you perfected it, it will be a sight to behold. I'm surprised you haven't used it in any of the practice matches, though." Keith blinked. "You've seen me fight?" Of course. Lotor leaned down to peer at Keith's face. You're one of the Academy's most promising students. I watched your assessment exam against Griffin the other day, and I can see why the instructors won't stop talking about you. However, the prince raised an eyebrow. You didn't use any moves like that. Keith grimaced, glancing away from the other boy's piercing stare. Most of the instructors don't approve of the bending style as outside school regulation. I see. Lotor's eyes glittered like he knew something Keith didn't. A pity. After that, Lotor went out of his way to befriend Keith. He'd often approach Keith while he was studying alone or eating lunch and asked to join him. Keith would awkwardly agree, and they'd just spend time together, sitting side by side, each silently working on their own task. It was kind of nice. This new behavior didn't go unnoticed, of course, and other students began treating Keith accordingly. Some were envious of the prince's attentions and made snide remarks when Keith was within earshot. Others tried to get on his good side, but he quickly brushed them off, well aware that their sudden interest wasn't genuine. He soon started to feel more relieved than anything when in Lotor's company, since no one dared jeer or imply anything with the prince present. Some of the teachers started treating Keith differently, too. They had always praised his abilities, but he now noticed they seemed less inclined to chastise his more insubordinate techniques. Even Iverson, when Keith experimentally used one of his original moves to win a practice match, turned an interesting shade of purple but didn't reprimand him. Keith wasn't really sure how to feel. In the winter of his third year at the academy, now 16 years old, Keith was approached by his classmate, James Griffin. Keith was sequestered in the school's library, poring over a book, when a shadow fell across the pages. Glancing up, he saw James standing there, looking oddly nervous. "Can I help you?" Keith asked, curious at the usually confident boy's fidgeting. He and James got along better now, but they still weren't exactly close. James had proclaimed himself to be Keith's rival almost immediately after their fight at the beginning of first year. Keith mostly ignored him, which just made James try even harder. A few months ago, Adam, tired of their petty squabbles and perfectly aware of the real reason behind James's behavior, assigned them as partners for an upcoming fire exhibition. It went about as well as you'd expect. At first, with constant arguing over their routine, Keith wanted to include his own touch since he knew Adam would approve of the added flair, but James was nearly as rigidly traditional as Iverson and insisted on sticking to the school-approved choreography. Once it became clear their positions as the top two of their class were in jeopardy. However, they reluctantly found a compromise, and once they started to work with each other instead of against each other, they discovered a mutual respect, and things actually went pretty smoothly. They aced the performance. After that, they didn't suddenly become best friends or anything, but at least they weren't constantly at each other's throats anymore. Sometimes they even had a civil conversation. James's hands fluttered like he wasn't sure what to do with them before he just shoved them in his pockets. "I wanted to ask you about something," he said, staring down at Keith's textbook like it held the answers to the universe. "Yes?" Keith prompted when he lapsed into silence. The other firebender took a deep breath, color burning high on his cheeks. "Are you going to the winter solstice with anyone this year?" James blurted out. Keith blinked. "I wasn't planning to, no." At Keith's response, something in James seemed to settle. He drew himself up taller. "Well, would you like to accompany me?" Oh. Keith had to admit, this was the last thing he'd expected. Maybe Adam's teasing remarks hadn't been jokes after all. "Sure," Keith replied once he'd recovered. "Really?" James asked in shock. Okay, great. I'll meet you there, next to the statue of Ron and Shaw." Keith nodded with a shy smile. "See you there." Do you have any plans for the solstice, Keith?" Keith and Lotor were sitting on the floor of a dojo, catching their breath after a quick sparring session. Keith had been pleasantly surprised when the prince asked to train with him. Lotor was widely regarded as the best firebender in the whole academy, and sparring with the prince was a fun challenge. At Lotor's question, Keith felt a bit of heat rush to his face. "Actually, James invited me to go with him," he said. Lotor went still, his cup of water pausing before it reached his lips. After a second, he carried on and took a drink like nothing had happened. "Is that so?" "Yeah," Keith smiled softly. "It was unexpected, but I'm looking forward to it." Lotor hummed an acknowledgement, but didn't comment after that. He switched topics and suggested improvements for Keith's technique, and Keith quickly forgot that they had even discussed the solstice. The night of the winter solstice, Keith stood in the crowded square by the large statue of the dragons Ron and Shaw, where he and James had agreed to meet. He waited, and waited, and waited. Keith never got a proper explanation for why James had stood him up. Every time he tried to confront the other boy, James would turn white and rush in the other direction. Eventually, Keith just gave up. Although he couldn't prove anything, Keith soon formed his own suspicions. Over the past couple of years, Lotor had become something of a companion to Keith, while still maintaining his aloof, princely persona. Shortly after the incident with James, however, Lotor became an almost constant presence in Keith's daily school life. Where before they would see each other only a few times a week, now the prince seemed to run into Keith every day. Then came the gifts. Every time Lotor joined Keith to study or spar, he'd offer Keith a present, usually something small like chocolate or a new whetstone for his blade. But as time progressed, the gifts became more elaborate: a jeweled hairpin, a silk robe, a new sword. Keith wasn't stupid. He realized pretty quickly that Lotor was trying to court him, and the timing certainly didn't escape his notice. But Lotor never acted anything less than ambitiously, and never gave any hint he might have sabotaged a rival suitor, so Keith wasn't given any opportunity to voice his suspicions, and social protocol dictated he couldn't refuse the gifts without reasonable cause. That said, Keith was still Keith, and made it clear by his fierce scowl when he took the gifts that he was none too pleased by Lotor's advances. Lotor wasn't fazed. If anything, Keith's defiant response seemed to amuse him, like he saw the whole thing as a fun game, and pursued him with renewed vigor every time Keith shot him down, showering Keith with even more attention and gifts. Any hope Keith had that Lotor's advances would lessen after the prince graduated and left the academy were quickly extinguished when he opened his front door to find a courier waiting. A new package arrived every day, each accompanied by a letter of adoration that Keith had to restrain himself from setting on fire. He didn't always succeed. Lotor's sending the gifts to Keith's home instead of giving them to him at school had another unfortunate side effect. "Keith," Cheryl said slowly, "why is there a small mountain of flowers blocking the hallway?" Keith scowled, continuing to shove a set of flora towards the rice-paper doors at the back of the house. "No reason," he replied petulantly. "Keith," Cheryl warned. Keith sighed as he slid the back doors open and began grabbing flowers by the handful, uncaring if the stems snapped or petals fell. "Lotor sent them," he said, as he threw the plants out into the yard with more force than necessary. Cheryl's eyebrows rose. "Lotor? Prince Lotor? Do you know of any other Lotors?" Keith snapped. Cheryl crossed his arms, unimpressed by Keith's temper. "And why exactly is the heir to our fine nation sending you flowers?" Keith's motion slowed to a stop, his head bowed, hair covering his eyes. He's been courting me for a while now," Keith admitted. "Oh?" A smirk grew on Cheryl's lips. "I never knew you had aspirations for royalty, Keith, and to think you used to be a little street urchin. Guess you're moving up in the world." Cheryl's laughter died when Keith didn't respond to the teasing. Concern bloomed across his face as he knelt down beside his brother. "Keith, what's wrong?" He listened as Keith explained what had happened with James and how Lotor refused to leave him alone. "I don't know what to do." Keith angrily gripped at his hair. "Every time I reject him, he just comes back stronger. Ignoring him doesn't work either, and he's the prince, so I can't just punch him or anything like that." Cheryl placed a warm hand on Keith's shoulder. Well, we'll think of something. Don't worry. It sounds like you've been handling this well so far. So for now, just keep doing what you're doing, and maybe he'll lose interest." "I'm sorry, I didn't tell you before," Keith said. "You're under so much stress already. I didn't want to pile my problems on top of you." It's not that big of a deal. It's just frustrating more than anything." "You're my brother, Keith." Cheryl fondly ruffled Keith's hair. "Your problems are my problems, and I will always be there to help you, just like I know you would be there for me." As the months passed, Keith fell into a routine of school lessons and firebending training. Lotor continued sending gifts and letters despite Keith's never responding, but didn't show up in person, no doubt too busy with his royal duties to visit his alma mater. I don't know. Keith was glad. It made ignoring him much easier. Then one day, when Keith was 18 and in his final year at the academy, Adam pulled him aside after class, a concerned frown marring his face. "Keith, I wanted to talk to you about the graduation ceremony, the firebending master said. It was a tradition for graduating students to give a performance during the ceremony, showing off the skills they had learned at the academy to proud family members and patrons, as well as the potential employers for those not going directly into the military. Is something wrong with my routine? Keith was planning an elaborate fire dance that would showcase both his knowledge of bending and his ability as a warrior. He'd been working on it for weeks now. No, Adam assured him. Your routine is a masterpiece. It's just that he retrieved a scroll from his desk drawer and held it out to Keith. We received this letter yesterday. Trepidation broiling in his gut, Keith opened the scroll and scanned its contents. He felt the blood drain from his face. Prince Lotor is challenging me to an Agni Kai? Keith read it incredulously. Why? While uncommon, it wasn't unheard of for students to show their skills in a firebending duel. It wasn't exactly like a traditional Agni Kai, as the fight wasn't about honor so much as ability, so no one had to get burned to end the fight, and the loser would still graduate, but Lotor wasn't a student anymore, so why? I believe I can answer that. A smooth voice startled the two. Keith whipped around to see none other than the prince himself saunter into the classroom. Prince Lotor, Adam greeted in surprise, hastily bowing. Lotor offered the instructor a polite nod before turning his attention back to Keith. You look lovely as ever, he complimented. Your hair has gotten longer. It suits you. Lotor was hardly one to talk. His own snow-white hair was almost the same length, falling down his back. He was also taller now. Keith bristled. What is this? He shook the scroll in front of Lotor's face accusingly. Lotor shrugged, his smile never wavering. So far, my methods of courting you have fallen upon deaf ears, so I've decided to appeal to your better nature. What better nature? Keith felt as confused as he was angry. You never back down from a challenge. Lotor's smile turned sharp. Some might call it foolish, but I've always seen it as one of your most admirable traits. I don't understand, Keith admitted, though through clenched teeth. I'm offering you a way out, so to speak. A wager, if you will. Lotor took Keith's hand. Duel me in a traditional Agni Kai. Should you win, I will stop pursuing you. No hard feelings, no questions asked. You'll never have to see or hear from me again, unless you wish it. And if I lose? Keith asked warily. He willed himself not to tense up as Lotor brought his knuckles to his lips. Then you agree to marry me. His eyes glittered. Do we have a deal? And you just agreed to that? Shiro demanded. What was I supposed to do? Keith jabbed at his noodles like he was holding a knife rather than wooden chopsticks. Say, no thanks, I'd rather stay in this fucking limbo of courting for another 3 years. No, I'm ending this now. Lotor might be annoying, but he honors his word. When I win, he'll finally leave me alone, and I won't have to worry about him taking his rejection out on you or me. That's only if you win, Shiro corrected him sternly. You're good, Keith, but so is Lotor. What are you going to do if he beats you? Keith gazed down at his food like it had murdered his best friend. I'll figure it out if the time comes. What I don't get is why he wants to do this at the ceremony. Shiro gave him a look, but allowed the shift in conversation. He probably just wants to make a show of it. It's not exactly a secret he's been chasing you for so long. At this point, it's a matter of pride. Plus, maybe he figures if he wins you over in such a public setting, you'll have no choice but to accept his proposal. Keith snorted. Like I care about that. Shiro smiled. True, you're not really the type to be trapped by social niceties. Clearly, he doesn't know you as well as he thinks. Clearly, Keith grumbled. Come on, Shiro said as they finished eating. I'll show you a few tricks that might come in handy during your duel. Keith raised an eyebrow as he followed his brother out to the backyard. I thought you had already taught me all your moves. You've been holding out on me? Shiro smirked as he shifted into position, body lowered and hands raised. His left wrist rotated palm up, and he beckoned Keith with the taut curl of his fingers. With a grin of his own, Keith leapt at his brother, worries temporarily forgotten in the heat of battle. Shiro was right. Keith was good, great even, but Lotor was the best, and on the day of the Royal Firebending Academy's graduation ceremony, the prince didn't hold anything back. And so Keith found himself staring numbly at the scroll that certified him as an alumni, barely even hearing the cheers of his fellow classmates as they celebrated around him. Slowly, his eyes drifted up from the diploma to his hand to his new fiancée. Lotor offered him a smirk in return.